Without further ado, I will now introduce our panelists. So we have Dr. Rebecca Whittington, who is Online Safety Editor at Reach. Hi, Rebecca. We have Tim Singleton, Head of International News at Sky News. We have Sophie Perry, Digital Reporter from the Oxford Mail, and Hannah Storm, who is Director of the Headlines Network. You should all have received biographies of our panellists today, and we'll also pop those in the chat during the course of today. But I would really like to thank all of our panellists for agreeing to take part today, and we look forward to a really interesting and an inspiring session. I'd like to start by handing across to Rebecca, who, as online safety editor, this is a particular expertise of hers. And Rebecca, I just wondered if you could start by summarising, why this is such an important topic at the moment, why it's so important right now.
The fact is that actually this has been a growing issue for some time. Digital convergence within news industry and journalism has kind of created creeping change, and actually, of course, there was a lot of unknowns that came about with that from the very beginning. And so part of that is that we see this increase in the ability to interact and message with our audience online, which brings vast benefits in terms of knowing what our audience wants, what they like, and what's important to them. But then at the same time, obviously, it means that there is that direct line of communication. It's no longer a one-way system in journalism anymore. We've got that two-way interaction. And obviously, in recent years as well, we have had this kind of perfect storm of situations happening. We've had Leveson, Brexit, the rise of Donald Trump and populism, the fact that we are seeing kind of anti-mainstream media messaging and rhetoric coming from some of those leaders as well, and that along with COVID and the pandemic and the kind of disillusion that we see within our society at times, I think has really created a perfect storm in terms of people wanting to message journalists, wanting to tell them what they think, and quite often those messages are actually shooting the messenger, because they don't like the news that's being reported and they don't like the information that's being served. Unfortunately, I think that this is a societal issue as well. It is something that particularly affects journalism because journalists are on the front line. But at the end of the day, we are all internet users, we're all social media users, and actually it is a societal issue where we're seeing this legitimization of online violence taking place on platforms, and actually it becoming okay to be violent and hateful and threatening online. So it is absolutely crucial in journalism that we talk about this, that we start to try and work to actually have preventions in place, protections in place, and that we work with social platforms and big tech to actually call for change, that we work with government and the police to actually see change happening as well. Because if we don't, essentially what we see from reports such as the research that was conducted jointly by Sheffield University and I can't remember the other organisation off the top of my head, which is terrible, I should know. There was a report called The Chilling, which came out earlier this week, and again pinpoints. Sorry, Hannah, tell me who it is.
It's UNESCO and ICFJ.
ICFJ, it was that. I couldn't remember the ICFJ, thank you. So The Chilling came out earlier this week, which just pinpoints the fact that that women and female journalists are very, very much being targeted by online and certain types of significant sexual and violence. And if we allow this to continue in journalism at all levels, so it doesn't need to be the most threatening, the most horrible messaging, it could be low-level threats, low-level harms that are taking place. But actually, if we continue to allow that happening without taking a grasp on it, we are essentially going to be silencing the voices, stopping people from being journalists, essentially, because they won't want to do it. Why would you want to work in an industry where you are likely to face threats on a regular basis, but don't have the protections and the reinforcement from your employers to actually deal with that? And of course, we want industry to be diverse, representative, reflecting the societies that we are operating in. So it is absolutely crucial that journalism is grasping this nettle and actually doing something about it.
Thanks, Rebecca. And it feels like, you know, certainly over the last few months that people are talking about it more, and people are sharing their experiences a bit more. So that awareness is being created because of that. And I just wondered, you know, just if, you know, some of our panelists can actually talk about some of their experiences, whether they're direct or indirect, and just be able to share it to the group today. I mean, Hannah, would you be able to pick that one up?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I'm really kind of grateful for what Rebecca's shared there, and she's done some amazing work. Rebecca's job was, her role is absolutely pioneering in the industry, and it's tremendous to know that organizations are really taking this seriously. You know, for a number of years we've been talking about journalistic safety. We've had people in place, you know, I've worked with Tim, I've worked with Rebecca, but you know, around the kind of physical safety stuff the past probably, you know, 15, 20 years or so. But actually in the last few years, we've been talking much more of that intersection of online safety and psychological safety too. And I think it's so important that we actually recognize that these things intersect. Rebecca there mentioned this notion of frontline. You know, there's a lot of people who are calling the kind of online violence this new frontline. And I think that's really important to note that, you know, we prepare journalists in the same way when they're going to cover situations that might expose them to online violence, that we prepare them for if they're going to other front lines. So we kind of think about what are the risks we can mitigate in advance, you know, what are the kind of training and tools that they need to support themselves, the emotional flak jacket, if you like, that Dr. Sian Williams, the broadcaster and psychologist, talks about a lot of the time. And then, you know, during, what do we have in place during, what do we have in place afterwards? So before, during and after, and that intersecting conversation about the different areas of safety. My specific experience myself is more around the kind of mental health experience. I've been a journalist for 25 years and lived and worked and travelled in many countries. And then I worked at INSEE, the International News Safety Institute, in the physical safety arena for the best part of a decade. But at the same time, I was experiencing my own kind of mental health concerns. I was diagnosed later on with PTSD. And so a lot of the experiences that I've seen kind of people have been very motivated to try and respond to, because I've both got the professional experience of coming under attack online, of coming under attack in the physical world as well, of sexual violence as well, and to kind of really kind of help people recognize that these are things that it's often really hard to talk about, but actually where we can feel like we have the safe spaces and where we have those tools to help build our resilience to tackle those, it can be really important to hear. And that's to say also that, you know, we need to create those spaces because it's not everybody feels all the time safe to be able to speak about those. I'll just mention one quick thing as well. You know, Rebecca talked there about this perfect storm. It has been a kind of long, it's not just COVID that has created a space where, you know, we're talking about it more, and it's super important we are talking about it more, but those previous few years beforehand, you know, there's a lot of pressure on journalism and journalists as well. And I'll just finish quickly by saying, I think that I strongly believe that we have to create these spaces to help speak, to help journalists feel more well, because I do think that it's a knock-on impact in terms of if we're not able to feel well, we can't do good journalism. So I do think they're closely connected. So very grateful for this space to talk today.
Thank you, Hannah. And Tim, what about from your end? You will have you've had some indirect experience as well from people that you've worked with. I just wondered if you could talk through some of your experiences.
So, well, first of all, massive fan of the NCTJ, and I put my first qualification for the NCTJ up there as one of the major accomplishments of my career, not to be underestimated.
Good to hear.
Forget that. So thank you for inviting me. 33 years later, gosh, hasn't the world changed a lot? And I think the word that comes to mind is immersion. I think journalists in 2022 are so much more immersed in society in that two-way way that Rebecca described, and it's very hard to stop yourself being drawn ever deeper into it. and sometimes it feels like there's no escape, especially when you're involved in international news in a 24/7 way with different time zones. But equally, if you're living and working in a society at local newspaper or local website level, where you live in and amongst your consumers, and I only have to look at some of the rows that erupt on my local Facebook group in a sort of innocuous suburb of West London, that tells me how difficult things can get. So it's irrelevant really whether you're talking about international news or national news or regional or local news. The issues are all familiar to us. And I think that immersion point is essential. And how do we get that breathing space from the world that we're now drawn into? Obviously, in my line of work, and especially this year, we've had to deal with that interface that Hannah describes with the more traditional physical threats, and the way that plays out in terms of mental health. Obviously, with Ukraine, it goes without saying. People will have seen the incident we had with our team led by Stuart Ramsey when the vehicle was attacked earlier this year. But we've had other incidents as well in Ukraine this year, and also things associated with modern warfare like drones, and that sort of constant stress of not knowing who's watching you. So the nature of warfare and the nature of threats has changed, and that affects the way we compute them in our minds. And then also increasingly, and I know Hannah's very invested in this, is the issues back here, both for friends, family and colleagues, how incidents affect them, the psychology of support, and also then edit suites, looking at pictures remotely. We've had issues across all these fronts, and it's a real challenge from a management perspective to keep on top of all the issues. I had a team in Pakistan last week, and I've just had a discussion with one member of the team about how fortunate it was that we were there when the incident with Imran Khan happened. From a journalistic perspective, we were fortunate to be there and we witnessed it. But of course, is that lucky or unlucky? Because there's a whole other range of issues you then have to digest and compute about the nature of that incident and whatever. So from our perspective in managing all these issues, regular check-ins, discussion, not just one check-in, but several over a period of time, not just in theatre, but also at home, and across a wider range of issues than perhaps over the course of my 33-year career that I've been accustomed to at the start. So many rewards from the modern world, but also many more challenges.
Absolutely, thanks, Tim. And as Tim says, the threat is everywhere, no matter what your role is within the industry. And Sophie, obviously you're a digital reporter, so you're kind of on the front line digitally every day and sort of having to deal with a lot of these issues. I mean, I wonder if you could sort of expand on some of your what you've experienced and what you've faced in your role.
Yeah, so firstly, obviously, thank you very much for inviting me onto this panel. I think it's a very important space to discuss this this topic. It's something that's certainly been brought to my attention quite a lot over the last couple of months. I've been asked to speak to several people who are doing research into safety and journalism well-being, so it's clearly a very hot topic at the moment. So in my role as a digital reporter, my job is pretty much to be as in tune with our local audience as possible on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. The idea is if they're talking about it on social media, we need to be talking about it. And so that naturally means that we are dialed in all the time to our social media feeds, into my mentions, into our emails, our DMs, everything like that. So it's very difficult to switch off. I think that's the big problem that not just digital reporters, but I think journalists of all stripes face nowadays, is this idea of being constantly turned on and aware of what's happening, and not being able to take space, take a break, because almost social media is very much connected to every part of our life now, and it doesn't end at 5 o'clock or 5:30 whenever you stop. So I know personally for me, there's been times where I've written a story and for whatever reason it's attracted quite a negative backlash from the local community and beyond. And my Twitter mentions have just been a barrage of people not necessarily critiquing the journalism or the story or the topic, but me as a person. So, and I've had to make the decision to come off social media, to take a break, which is obviously difficult in my line of work, to have to say to my editor, right, the main tool I use to do my job, I really do not wish to use for the next couple of days, and just take a break. But it's very important to have those discussions, I think, with your editors, with your managers, about when you need to take time off, because obviously we treat mental health a lot better than we used to, but mental health is as important as physical health. If you've broke your leg, you're not going to go to the gym, are you? You're not going to keep doing something that's going to harm you. So you've got to treat your brain and your mental health like a muscle that is very much something you have to look after and give it a rest when it needs it. So I think it's really important to have these discussions, and for management to be having these discussions about when journalists can kind of come away from social media, take a step back, have that break, and it, not be seen as a weak step or something that will negatively impact the journalism, but instead will have a much more positive impact on the journalist and the culture and the storytelling of what you're doing in the long term. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, especially in terms of social media, because obviously different sites have different regulations. What's going to happen with Elon Musk taking over Twitter, all these different things, freedom of speech, what's hate speech, what is free speech, all these different discussions. Very complicated topic, which we're not going to reach the conclusion to that today, surely, but I think it's very important to have these discussions on panels like this.
Thanks, Sophie. And I think it's really, interesting what you say about having that time out and actually creating boundaries for yourself, so that you're not on 24/7 and then you're exposed, or you're at risk of sort of being under threat. And Rebecca, I know in your role, you've actually put together, quite a number of guidelines for journalists. And I wonder if we could move on to that topic, really, is, if you do come across it, we've created the awareness. What then should a journalist do if they experience, any threats online or otherwise?
I think there's a number of things that a journalist can do. I think first and foremost, what I would really love journalists to be doing and their workplaces to be reinforcing is actually getting your protections in place before something happens. And actually the materials in the training course, one of the slides that I shared with you obviously was about the workplace culture. And if you get the welfare, the pastoral elements right, and the protective elements right, then the need for a response is often reduced, both in terms of it happens less, you'll have less online harms happen to you, but also you'll recover more promptly from those online harms because you've got those protections and that kind of structure and welfare in place. And I think the idea of resilience as well, just to mention, I think is an interesting idea, because I think sometimes people think resilience just means growing a thicker skin, whereas actually it's clearly not that. And what Hannah was saying is so important about it, kind of giving you the tools to actually approach adversity, deal with adversity, and then recover from adversity. If something does happen to you, I think the best piece of advice that I can give is put it down, step away from the machine, and ask for some support, because actually as soon as you vocalize that need for support, you have somebody coming in to help you, who could in theory go into your accounts to put your notification settings higher, to block off your DMs, to screen grab the abuse, to get the URL of that tweet or whatever it might be, to block and report those particular people that are being abusive towards you, to remove them from the Facebook pages, to ask if you're okay. And I think that is really crucial, because if you don't reach out for support, it can be very, very overwhelming and very isolating. And also in something like a backlash, like Sophie mentioned, that can escalate exceptionally quickly. So you can be sitting on your sofa on a Saturday evening, you're not on duty, and suddenly you're aware that all your Twitter handles are basically pointing at you. And it's like you're standing naked on the top of a mountain with lots of people standing underneath, pointing and laughing at you or shouting horrible things at you. It can make you feel very vulnerable and isolated and exposed in that way. But actually, if you can get somebody to support you, to pull those shutters down, to actually mean that you can step back and have that time away, that recovery time, and the time for it to die back down, because quite often the backlash will die off as quickly as it starts. You just need the time back to actually allow that to happen. And I think, so my top tip to anybody, because people come to this from all different situations and circumstances, is speak to somebody, try and get that support, and tell people what's happening, because it's a problem shared. I hope that helps.
Apologies, I couldn't work out the mute button. Thanks, Rebecca. Hannah, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple of things. And thank you. It's so important what Rebecca says. I think that there's a few things I've just jotted down, and so I'll just run through them quickly. When we talk about online harassment, sometimes we see kind of two, I guess, different ends of the spectrum. We see the kind of things that we might call microaggressions, otherwise called microaggressions, which can build up cumulatively to have a big impact on us. And I think sometimes those impacts might come quite further down the line. And other times we see the really, really egregious stuff. Now we know that, you know, it's generally women who are targeted most. It's generally members of the LGBTQ+ communities who are massively targeted with online vitriol. We know that people tend to, the result can often be self-censorship and people stepping away. So there's the kind of really, the really egregious stuff, and then the kind of cumulative stuff. We mustn't ignore the cumulative stuff as well, because often we become conditioned to accept those and just kind of like think, it's nothing. Rebecca's point about getting to a safe space, you know, I've done quite a few of these hostile environment training courses when you get sent to kind of these difficult, dangerous places, and, you know, you often undergo an ambush, and the first thing they tell you to do is get to a safe space. So be that in the online environment or be that in a physical environment. I say to John Crowley, who's my co-director at Headlines Network, he's heard me say this a lot, but the first two letters of mental health in English are me, M-E. So we have to prioritize ourselves. We have to look after ourselves. We have to put on our oxygen masks first, because otherwise we can't do anything. So do that, then find help, as Rebecca mentioned, in terms of find somebody you trust. It might be a manager, it might be a peer. Find somebody you trust to say, oh, something difficult is happening, I need some help. Two more points that I want to make quickly. One is, Tim mentioned before, remote trauma, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, the stuff that's impacting us, which is we're not directly exposed to other people's trauma. Super important that we're aware of that at the moment. And at Headlines, we're launching some tools around that next week. And I know that we mentioned that it's mentioned in the NCTJ work. Really important that we recognise that. The second point about story sharing, and Tim mentioned Stuart Ramsey's, the awful experience Stuart and his team dealt with in Ukraine. When we hear other people's stories, it does help us feel less alone. We heard his story on our podcast recently. And then just 5 mini tips for you. I've been jotting down A, B, C, D, and E's in terms of how can we help ourselves and how can others around us help us. The first one is acknowledging. So I'm going to do A, B, C, D, E. Acknowledging somebody's experience is super important. Acknowledging the important role that somebody plays as a journalist and the job that they were doing. That's your A. B goes to Sophie's point and Rebecca's point about boundaries. The importance of boundaries cannot be, you know, we can't overestimate the importance of boundaries. Breaking away, giving ourselves a break and stepping back. We've been disconnected from our colleagues and community and hyper-connected online. The C is compassion and connectivity and conversations. Talk to people, have compassion for ourselves and recognise what we're going through. The D is decompression and debriefing. After we've gone through something difficult, been through a difficult story, endured something difficult online, let's create the space where we can speak with the people, have some decompression time, step away, do a different story if we can, if needs be, but certainly debrief. And the E for me is probably the most important thing. Our skills as journalists mean that we show empathy to people whose stories we amplify, empathy, and yet very rarely do we actually show that empathy to ourselves. So I encourage people to kind of create those spaces where actually we can say to ourselves, we're dealing with something icky and difficult, and actually the empathy we can show ourselves as we do the stories, the kind of sources of stories we amplify, let's turn that on ourselves, and hopefully that empathy can help us kind of do our jobs better as well and be better.
Thanks, Hannah. That's really useful, the ABCDE model. Thank you. And Sophie, if you don't mind, I just wanted to come back to you, because obviously we've heard from Rebecca and Hannah that sort of talking to somebody that you trust is really important as part of this. So when you sort of had that experience and you had to shut down, did you feel confident to be able to speak to whether it was a family member or, you know, your editor? I mean, what did you do in that situation?
Yeah, so my editor is, of course, my first line of contact with this, and I'm lucky that I have an editor who is very pro making sure that all our mental health is looked after. And, you know, we often have chats just touching base about things. The logic being that obviously if we're suffering mentally, we're not going to produce the best work, and it's just not a very pleasant workplace environment to exist in. So he was certainly the first point of call. I guess this goes for quite a lot of media companies, that since COVID they've brought in a lot of well-being workshops and materials, things. So NewsQuest, who owns the Oxford Mail, has mental health lines you can reach out to, information. They can help signpost you to other things, which I you know, I'm aware of, and I know other colleagues have used that. And that's a really important thing, I think, for companies to be proactive about making sure that employees know where they can turn, who they can go to speak with someone, be it Samaritans, or you know how to seek, say, therapy or counselling or something through the company, obviously, especially if it's related to the job that you do and the impacts that can have in the rest of your life. So I think going on from obviously COVID brought mental health as a massive thing to the attention of the public, more so than it already was. That I think these steps they shouldn't be faltering now. There should be much more of an emphasis, which is why something like this safety and resilience training is ever more important, to raise awareness about what we can do to protect our mental health, who we can go to, the support we can seek. You know, is there specific counselling services for people who are LGBT? Are there specific counselling services if you are not white? You know, you want to speak to someone who understands your experiences in terms of how your identity intersects within the workforce. Those sort of things are very, very important, and I certainly think that especially bigger media companies really don't need to take the foot off the accelerator with that, and they really need to continue to drive home that to their employees, that these things are available and out there.
Thanks, Sophie. And Tim, over to you, because you know, at Sky, I mean, what sort of procedures do you have in place to encourage people to speak up? And then, you know, what sort of forums do you provide for people to be able to raise these issues?
Yeah, an example, we had one recently, a reporter who was getting some series of very nasty emails. So she did the right thing. We have a unit which in the main looks after our sort of physical welfare, equipping people with equipment abroad, but it also has links into greater resources across Sky. So that unit was able to refer that reporter into our cybersecurity unit, Sky's broader function. They were able to give very effective advice about what to do in terms of blocking, filtering, all that kind of stuff. That was in relation to email, but we're lucky at a company like Sky that we have resources across the building that can deal with things like that. We have a mental health helpline. Part of the issue is continually is knowing how to flag up that resource and make it available. It's easy in a big organization to lose sight of the resources that do actually exist, and it's about being quite laser focused on what we have, and you know, messaging is only effective if you repeat it and keep putting the information out there, rather than sort of one email a year. A constant cycle of reinforcement, if you like. And then I think there's something on social media. I was struck by something our correspondent in America, Mark Stone, filed in a piece of analysis online last night about the nature of the current midterms in America and the information space, where there's so many conspiracy theories going around. And you know, Sky News, we say, you know, our values are no agenda, facts, and which takes me back to my NCTJ, you know, the first principles of journalism: check and check again. It's so easy these days in that 24/7 environment that Sophie was describing, to sort of get drawn into social media and communicate in perhaps at the wrong time and in a way that's not helpful. And if you kind of train yourself to restrict your involvement to when you've got your work head on, and then there's a space for it, because social media, there's a way of conveying information on it which is useful to us all as professional journalists, but that's not the only function of social media. Social media also trades on dispute, on invective, on all that other stuff that exists. And actually, I think, I only want to work in social media in a way that is quite pure in that professional way. So actually, my social media posts are quite dull. You won't get much revelatory stuff about me, my life, or my opinions. It's, we've done this report from this place, please watch it, or which might not lead to massive traction. I've not got Piers Morgan style followers, but that's my role, and therefore I can restrict my reach in it in quite a healthy way for me. That doesn't stop me, of course, scrolling through Twitter at 11 p.m. for whatever reason, and I have to check myself. That's not particularly healthy. I don't need to worry about it right now. I need to go to bed. So it's about that compartmentalization, which I think is essential to all our health, good health, really, as journalists, and knowing when to engage and when to stand off. Let it go. Someone's having a go at our piece, but you know what? It's not going to be healthy for me to get engaged with that. Let it go. And often that's the best way.
Yeah, and I think the difficulty is that it can be, it's quite emotive, isn't it, when you get criticism about your work, or if or alongside the abuse. And I think, Rebecca, if anybody is thinking of responding because, say, they've got, they're accusing somebody of inaccuracy or so on, or they're just having a go at their work, what would you advise? Would you advise they respond, or just to completely ignore it?
I think it does vary. I don't think there's a one size fits all response, but my general advice is don't interact, because quite often if we see somebody who is being trolled and they're kind of making horrible comments about their journalistic ability, about the product that they work for, the brand that they work for, or whatever, actually getting into a conversation with those people, gives them the time, it gives them your time. Are they worth your time? I think it's genuinely worth considering. Are these people worth my time? Not only that, but they will then come back. They will thrive on that. They're engaging you in conversation at that point. And if they start out on that negative slant, you may win them round, but I think 9 times out of 10, probably 9.5 times out of 10, you're not going to, and you're just going to bring that conversation out. It'll last for longer. And at the end of it, will you be in a better position than when you started that conversation with that person? If the answer is no, I actually can't see this ending up in any different situation to where I already am, then I would say step away. The other thing is, it's actually quite difficult to take the moral high ground if you then get into an argumentative spat with someone online, which at times is difficult, because then somebody might turn around and accuse you of being abusive. And actually, of course, it may not be true at all. You may have just been rebuffing their original abuse. But in the heat of the moment, it can be quite tempting to kind of like have that quick, sparky interaction. And I would say instead, put the phone down, move away from the keyboard, and actually go and kick something, have a cup of tea, or, some fresh air, some deep breaths, stop and think. And I really do think that is, the best thing that people can do. There have been times, because there is this issue, and we talk about, you mentioned criticism, and then where does criticism become abuse? And I think what we could say is that constant and persistent and pernicious criticism from an individual towards one journalist, that is abusive potentially. But people have the right to criticise, and people have the right to have their opinions. So actually, what I suggest in the case where somebody is levying criticism about, not necessarily about your journalistic ability, because I don't think that should be responded to, but about the story itself or about content itself, I think if you give them very clear instructions about how to make a formal complaint, then if they continue to to say the same things, they are being abusive, and you can take the action against that person who's being abusive. You block, you report, etc. So I do think that directing them specifically, if they have a complaint, towards how to make a complaint, because sometimes people don't use the official channels anymore because it's easier to do it on social. It's easier just to message someone. So actually telling them how to do that, I think, gives you that control back without meaning that you're not kind of losing footing on that. But yeah, interestingly, and I'll just mention this briefly, we had one of our news brands had a parody account that was set up, for example, and the account would regularly kind of message about them and kind of include the journalists working for that account within the posts that they were writing as well. And we blocked them entirely, and it went from being about 6 posts a month to 0 posts a month because they just weren't getting the oxygen. Nobody was interacting with it from that title, and it really kind of squeezed their oxygen out of it. And actually I would say that response quite often just doesn't get you anywhere. Ignoring and blocking gives you the high ground. The other good thing about blocking and putting your mute notifications high is that actually they might be moaning about you blocking them, or ignoring them, but you don't know because you've blocked them, and your life is infinitely better for it. So I would definitely recommend blocking and muting over interacting, because your life is improved by that.
And also taking a step back in the heat of the moment, because that's when you're more likely to sort of react. Okay. Hannah, we've obviously heard about what journalists can do if they experience any of this, and it's important to sort of go to the editor or a colleague that you trust at work. What about for freelance journalists? What advice would you give to them?
I think that's a really good point, because I think obviously freelance journalists are very much often less resourced, have less support. So I think it's super important that we acknowledge that. I think I would just say one thing about what Rebecca's just mentioned there. There's something really important about that contractual agreement between the kind of the audience and the journalist as well, and understanding that. But one of the things I would say is that also that thing that Rebecca's just explained is very nuanced, because if you consider that the motivation often for people attacking people online is to silence them, and then we as managers or news organizations say don't feed the trolls or don't respond, that's potentially particularly difficult. But if we can then create spaces where actually we're hearing from the person who's been hurt within the news organizations or within news networks, that acknowledges that what they've endured is real, and actually it doesn't expose them to further kind of vitriol online. It has been a really kind of difficult, nuanced conversation. From a freelance perspective, what I would say is that there are a number of really brilliant networks out there that are supporting freelancers. There's the Rory Peck Trust is one of them in particular. There are a number of different networks within organisations across the country, across the UK, who are supporting freelancers as well. The Society for Freelance Journalists, which was set up by John Crowley, who's my colleague at Headlines Network, is super important too. There are a number of things from a self-care perspective that freelancers can employ themselves just as employed journalists can. When we think about mental health, we think about what are the things we can do to support ourselves. So can we ensure that we're getting, decent, it sounds really trite perhaps, but it's super important. Anthony Feinstein, who I work with a lot in the mental health space, often says that sleep is the barometer of mental health. So what can we do to ensure we're trying to get decent sleep? We switch off our notifications, or we don't engage at 11 p.m. as Tim has mentioned. Are we ensuring we're getting activity, getting some exercise? Are we ensuring we've got things outside of journalism that keep us going? Are we ensuring we're eating healthily? We're creating breaks for ourselves. We're hydrating ourselves, not with booze the whole time. Are we recognizing, this is kind of one of my favorite things. This is my daisy glass here. And this is my kind of glass of resilience. Are we recognizing where our glass of resilience is? So at the moment, I've got quite a lot of space in my glass of resilience, so I can top it up, and I've got that much space I can deal with. But at the moment, say for instance, it's at that stage there, so it's got much more in, I've got a lot less space. So as individuals ourselves, be as freelancers, be as employed journalists, are we a bit more in tune with ourselves in terms of how things are going? And if things are getting, well, we've not got much space in our glass, have we got people we can speak with amongst our kind of broader network, be they journalists or non-journalists as well? and other people we can rely on. But I would say finally, from the freelancer perspective, you are so important as a community, freelancers. We rely on you so much more and so much more heavily than we have been, perhaps sometimes to people's detriment, but we cannot do journalism without freelancers. And there are many, many networks out there that do exist to support you and that can help support you as well in a way that perhaps we hadn't really considered. But reach out, speak with people, and then also, as I say, recognize where you are in terms of your coping strategies as well.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm sort of conscious we're coming to the end of our session. Before I ask our panelists to make some closing comments, if you do have some questions that you don't think have been covered today, please pop them in the chat, or of course you can contact us after with any sort of questions you have, and we can put it to the panel separately. So Tim, starting with you, how would you sum up everything that we've discussed today from your point of view?
Well, look, there's all sorts of aspects to it, but certainly talking about what you have seen, been through, you know, at whatever level, is the fundamental truth. And I have to, you know, I've not always been the best at doing that myself, and you know, this is a learning thing as you go through life, never mind just regarding journalism. One of the best things I ever did was when I was at the Department for International Development. They wanted to hear from sort of leaders about your own mental health challenges, and then sort of turned it around and sat on a panel, and I talked about the day when Joe Cox died, and I knew Joe a bit. We'd had dinner a few times, a bit socially and a bit professionally, and a few people in the newsroom knew that, and suddenly you're hearing it breaking on the news that someone you know has died, and then people are running in saying, can you do this, can you do that, what do you know, and dealing with that was very difficult. Anyway, without going into that, being able to talk about that was a really interesting thing for me, and a learning for me about actually that, you know, that was 2 or 3 years after the event. And I've never really talked about it with anyone about what that felt like, you know, in a leadership position in the newsroom with that all going on. So in truth, the ability to talk, discuss, as other people have said, with wherever you can find that space. For me that day, that was a panel at work, and it was in a very public way, but it needn't be like that. It can be with a colleague, a trusted friend, or someone outside the industry, or if you're lucky enough to work as I do at Sky, which has resources and facilities, by A, finding them out if they're not on obvious display, and then B, utilizing them. And it's a big thing to be not necessarily afraid of it, to be skeptical of it or cynical about it, but actually just to go into it with an open mind, and go on a little bit of a journey with it, and trust that wherever you end up, it will have been profitable.
Thanks, Tim. Before I move on to Sophie, we've just had a question in the chat from Dominic, who runs a Sports News UK, and he has asked that as a small independent site owner, he often gets requests to take things down, or is just gets a lot of questions about his content. Given he's such a small operation, would you have any advice in terms of, you know, when this happens, if people are kind of putting the pressure on to remove articles and so on? I think he's making the point here that he hasn't got the money as such to, you know, engage in long legal battles. So, you know, as an independent publisher, would you have any advice? Rebecca, what do you think in that situation?
I can see the question, and I think that one thing that I find is that we have things that come up quite regularly. So it might be somebody asking for something to be taken down because it's an inquest and they don't like the inquest being reported, for example. Now, obviously, that might not be the case on this particular one, but I imagine that there's things that kind of come up again and again. He finds himself typing the same things again and again to these individuals. Set yourself out a document that's got some template responses on it, so you can just copy and paste those, and that saves you loads of time. It also saves you emotional energy, because having to think about how to respond specifically every time, and you can always tweak them so that they reflect the comment that's being made or the request that's being made. Obviously, one size doesn't fit all, but often one size can be adapted so that it does fit. And I think that that really is a time saver, and also, like I say, an emotional saver as well.
Thanks, Rebecca. Dominic, I hope that helps. Sophie, some closing comments from you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo a lot of what Tim said. You know, it's a very wide-ranging topic, this idea of safety and resilience and what that means in 2022, nearly going into 2023. But I think the main thing we need to do is talk about it. If we don't talk about what messages we're receiving, what emails, the vitriol, as we say, the microaggressions, all the way up to the really intense abuse that journalists can get, then nothing's going to ever be done about it. So we need to talk about it, raise awareness of it, because I think a lot of the general public, our readers, probably don't realise that that's what we have to deal with on a day-to-day. I think some of us just think we just turn up, write some things, go home, and that's it, and we don't have to think about any extra issues that arise from our job. Again, similarly to what Tim said, if you are lucky enough to work for a company that has resources, find out where those resources are, make use of them, speak to your line manager. There are, of course, other places outside of work that you could contact, for example, Samaritans and other free talking services that can be really, really helpful in a time when you perhaps just need to speak to someone, just get something off your chest, and use that as a way to perhaps put your mental health first. But as we say, it's a very complicated topic. There's a lot of ins and outs to it, and things like this, panels like this, a course like the Safety and Resilience course is exactly what's needed to kind of help move these discussions along and maybe make some progress. And you know, future journalist students who might be in this call maybe one day won't have to deal with what some people have done, and of course that would be brilliant, but it has to be talked about to get there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sophie. And Hannah?
I'm just going to put my A, B, C, and D in E's in the chat, just in case anybody wants to copy them. They're not.
Thank you.
Science, but, a couple of things. First of all, there are still quite a few taboos in our industry, and I think it's important to recognise that. At times like this, when we're under increasing financial and economic pressures, it can be really difficult when we feel isolated already because of mental health to speak about things, particularly if we are traditionally marginalised by our identity by the media industry. So it's incumbent on organisations to create the spaces where people feel safe to be able to share those experiences. Too often I hear from journalists, I can't talk about my experience because I'm worried about missing out on the next promotion. I'm worried about not getting the next gig. So journalist managers have to create those spaces where they say, this is confidential. Nothing you say here is going to impact on your career progression. It's really interesting to hear Tim talk about Jo. I worked with Jo at Oxfam as well, and I had my own kind of Jo moment where she was when she was murdered, and it was horrific. But actually to hear from leaders about something to do with their mental health, you know, often we're conditioned to show that to believe in journalism, vulnerability, admissions of vulnerabilities of weakness. I actually strongly believe it's a strength. That's why we talk with famous journalists on the podcast that we run, including people like Stuart Ramsey, who I mentioned, and for Headlines Network. But I'd like to just close, I think, by saying one thing. You know, yes, proponents of AI might disagree with me, but I do not believe that journalism can exist without journalists. I do strongly believe that journalists are the most precious resource we have. And if we don't maintain and sustain our well-being and mental health, be that our physical well-being, be that our mental well-being, which are two sides of the same coin, then we're not going to have good journalism. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of create those spaces, those cultures, those conversations to keep on talking about it. And, you know, where we don't have that ability ourselves because we're not clinicians and doctors and medical people, as Sophie has mentioned, we signpost people to the right places. This is a cracking way to start the conversation and continue the conversation. It's brilliant work that the NCTJ is doing, and you know, it's an immense privilege to be part of the conversation here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And Rebecca, finally.
Thank you. I mean, so much of what my fellow speakers have said today, you know, it's just so good to hear people talking about all this stuff and the spectrum that is safety, because I don't feel that online safety is separate from physical safety. I think online safety has significant physical implications. A physical safety incident can also result in online harms taking place as well. and there's the psychological harms that are connected to all of that. So it is really great, and I know that Hannah has talked about this a lot as well, you know, the fact that we shouldn't be siloing these different issues, and actually we need to look at it holistically. And actually I would just like to say Headlines Network's podcast to the audience, really worth listening to. It is brilliant. I also completely agree with what Tim said about leaders talking about their own experiences and their own, you know, talking essentially. I think that we really need to be leading by example. Leaders need to be investigating their own mental health and well-being and making sure that that filters down. And I think it's very easy when something happens to you in this very fast-paced environment to kind of put it on the list, the to-do list of things to deal with. It's never at the top of the to-do list. It's always at the bottom. I'll deal with that at the end of the day. And then the end of the day happens and it doesn't get dealt with, and it goes further and further down and never ever gets dealt with. I think one of the things that's resonated out of this today, and Sophie's talked about it, and Hannah and Tim, about the debrief, and about, you know, making sure that you kind of like talk about what's happened to you, that you actually kind of get it off your chest, that you do that in some way or another. So all of those things I would absolutely endorse. The last thing I would like to say is that protection is the best form of defense. And so, and it is, somebody's put in the chat actually interestingly about the physical, you know, it's like deal with it like you would in the physical space. And I recently did some high risk environment training. I took part in that, and I was just like, this is just the same as online. You know, what do you do in a crowd situation? The crowd is busy, it's packed, it is dangerous. Do you go further into the crowd? No, you don't. You get yourself out of that crowd. You move to the sidelines, you find a safe space. It's very simple, simplified way of kind of looking at it. But actually, A, do you go into that crowd in the first place, thinking about your protections? And B, if you're in that crowd, get out of that crowd, kind of thinking about yourself and treating it like you would in the physical sense. And I actually think that really helps as well with when you have those microaggressions, somebody says something vile to you, dismissing it because it's online. If somebody said that to you in the street, would you dismiss it? No, you'd probably go home and be like, outraged, but also disgusted at that person and not willing to accept it. We should be taking it that way. We should be treating it that seriously. So I'm really just so pleased that this conversation is being had, that there's been so many useful takeaway tips from this panel as well, because I think that's really important. We all know there's an issue. Moving on to that next stage where we actually take away is just so valuable. So thanks to the NCTJ for that.
Thank you, Rebecca. So our hour is nearly up, so I'd like to thank you all for attending the session today. I hope you all found it useful, and I'd like to thank our brilliant panelists for taking the time to be able to share their experiences and offer some advice, which I'm sure, as we say, there's a lot of takeaways there for everybody. We would like to hear feedback, so everybody that's attended today, you'll be receiving a feedback form via email today or tomorrow. Also, if you'd like to contact us, if after this session something occurs to you that you wish you'd asked us, then please do get in touch. We've put the details in the chat as well. Thank you. Thanks everybody. I hope you all have a good day, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.